And it's becoming life-threatening how long we had to wait. I still felt good. I was still moving, and I completed a rappel. And I call up after every rappel and tell the person above me, off rappel. I yell up, off rappel. So the next person knows that they can hook in and start descending the rope. And all I heard back was help. I thought that was very odd.
Welcome to the Sharp End Podcast YouTube channel. I'm Ashley, the creator and hostess of the show. This podcast aims at minimizing future outdoor accidents by way of storytelling. Real people sharing real stories.
Okay, so we are now officially recording. Welcome to the show, Michael. I'm Ashley. It's good that you're here. We've been talking about this for not too long, but yeah, welcome to the show. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Well, thank you. So I'm Michael Habicht. I'm a climber for about 30 years, and I started on Shasta. I got guided. I was called to the mountains, and I must go. So I got guided in Shasta when I was in college. And then my next experience was a gym, probably one of the first gyms in the U.S., Mission Cliffs. It was mid to late 90s, maybe like 94, 95. And I've just been climbing ever since. I've had lots of interruptions. I had to go back to school. I've had kids. So I always called myself a very experienced climber, just not a very good climber. I've been struggling at the 511 range for about 30 years. So that's where I'm stuck.
And where do you live?
I live in South Lake Tahoe. My wife and I met as climbing guides, and we decided we wanted to move to a mountain town and be still close to family in San Jose and the Bay Area. So South Lake Tahoe was a great place to land, close to a international airport, very close to climbing. Lover's Leap is 15, 20 minutes away. So we just get out and play as much as possible.
That's great. I've climbed at Lover's Leap and it was lovely.
It's got some old school stuff, like Yosemite style, trad bolted stuff, and it's got just classic lines. There's a line in the 50 classics there on Lover's Leap.
I think from what I remember when I climbed on Lover's Leap, I felt pretty sandbagged. Is that a good memory, or?
There's some of I would say the sport climbs, quote unquote, sport climbs are pretty sandbagged. The 30-foot run out type things.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for being here again. And what are we talking about today? What happened? Where were you?
So I turned 50 this year, and I wanted to give myself a big trip. And I decided to do Ama Dablam in Nepal. I've done some mountaineering. I've been up Rainier. I did Denali with a group of friends, unguided. And that was pre-COVID, and COVID shut down my trip planning for about 2 years. And I finally got back around and decided to do a trip. I had planned to go with a partner, and I wanted to be as independent as possible. Unfortunately, my partner hurt himself a couple of months before the trip and said he wouldn't be ready. So I said, well, I'll just do it solo. Ama Dablam is about 20 miles south of Everest. And it's 6,800 meters approximately. And it is just a gorgeous thumb sticking out. Everybody has trekked past it, has said that's a beautiful mountain, and it really calls. And the easiest way up is a fixed line route on the sort of south buttress area, and takes 30 days to acclimatize and to get up this mountain. So I took off for 30 days and did my best to get up there. I never quite summited. And I had no idea what to expect. I'd never been to Nepal. I had never been to Kathmandu. It is an amazing place. I'm a very untrusting traveler. I've been robbed in the past, and I was very skeptical about signing up for what's called base camp services. I signed up with a company called Seven Summits to get me to the base camp, and they would feed and house me from Kathmandu to the base camp. And after that, I was on my own. So Camp 1 and Camp 2.
That helps with logistics quite a bit.
Oh, it was great. And I landed. I didn't have cell service. I didn't want to turn my phone on. All I had was Wi-Fi, but there's no Wi-Fi in the baggage claim area in Nepal. And so I just walked out, and they had a picture of me from my WhatsApp profile in a ski helmet. And the guy recognized me wearing a ski helmet and goggles. And he's like, "That must be you." And I was like, "Oh, you guys are great." They were really wonderful. Spent about 2 days in the city and then flew in.
Wait, so just pause for 1 second. When was this?
Oh,
what
this is
month?
April 2023. So approximately April 15th to May 15th, 2023.
Okay, so it's July 18th right now. So that was only a couple months ago.
A couple months ago. It's the slightly wetter season for Ama Dablam. Apparently, it's much better in the fall season, like October, November. And that'll be part of my story. It snowed almost every day, and the base camp managers were actually quite shocked. They said they'd never seen it snow every day in April. So we were looking for a weather window for much of my time I spent alone. And that's an interesting thing to do, is to go alone and be the only person at base camp for a couple days with nobody who speaks English, and you're just really grinding out the books. I read 11 books in 30 days.
Wow.
Waiting out weather.
I'm sure many people can relate to that.
So you land in Nepal, you fly to a little airport called Lukla, and then it's like a 4-day trek in because you land at 9,000 feet and you hike horizontally for a day, then you hike vertically and you get to Namche Bazaar, which is about 14,000 feet. Please forgive me, I'm going to use feet mostly for this, even though meters.
That's okay,
meters would be
because
appropriate.
sure, but most of the listeners are from the U.S. and we do, So the imperial versus metric thing is driving me nuts too, but here we are.
If you're not even a climber, spending a couple days in Namche Bazaar is just a gorgeous experience, and I highly recommend it. A really beautiful place to hang out. There's 20,000, 25,000 foot peaks all around, and they're just sort of they're sacred peaks to the locals, but to the climbers, they're like, nah, we don't climb that. It's not worth it because it's not tall enough and it's not important enough. But there's things that are taller than all of the Americas just sitting there essentially unclimbed all the time. And then you trek in to base camp after Namche, and base camp is about 15,000 feet. And unfortunately, I was sick as a dog just traveling. It was like 36 hours in a plane in airports. So I had a flu-like illness for like the first 4 days. I trekked in
that's a bummer.
With a couple other guys, one from Canada, one from South Korea. And my base camp services, we split up and they went to go do an acclimatizing peak because they were being fully guided. And I went straight to base camp, and I just parked it for like 5 days, unfortunately. And it's being solo is a really unique experience because you don't have anybody to bounce ideas off of how do you feel? What do you feel about this? What are your vibes? Are you getting the, turn around, tail between your legs vibe? Are you still good to go? And so you have to do that all internally. Believe it or not, there's actually Wi-Fi at base camp, but only intermittently. So I used my Garmin InReach, would text my wife, and she would constantly remind me, no, you got 30 days. You're only on day 7. Keep trucking. And eventually I did some acclimatizing hikes, got up to 19,000 feet to Camp 1. But it was really unique because it's supposed to be a dirt trek and some scrambling, but it's all covered in 10 inches of snow, and it's snowing 2 inches to 6 inches every day. And you're just waiting for this weather window, and you're just plodding along, and you're supposed to be wearing approach shoes to get to Camp 1, but I ended up in big boots,
mountaineering boots. Yeah.
Just making it more painful and slow. And so you acclimatize, you go up, you come back down. I spent a night up there. I found out that there was lots of empty tents. What they do is they just set up the tents for the season, and all the guide companies talk to each other and say, hey, we're sending up 3 people, you can use our tent. We're sending up 5 people, you can use their tents. And so I talked to my base camp manager and I said, hey, I brought my own tent along. Do I really need it? And they said, no, you can use one of our tents. So, and there's lots of detritus in these tents. There, there's used canisters and, leftover food. There's no bears. I saw a marmot-like creature. I don't know what he was, but there's lots of birds. Birds peck the heck out of all the stuff that was left over in the tents. So it wasn't unpleasant, but it was not the best camping experience in the world. And these tents are perched on this rock ridge it's just mind-boggling. And, 10 feet in any direction and you're falling to your death. And they're super uncomfortable because there's no flat spots. The tents are just on rocks, and some of those rocks, you get a pebble in your back in the middle of the night, you're like, that's annoying. I'm talking about, shoe-sized rocks underneath you. And so you're just sleeping in a position just to avoid that rock all night. But I had a good experience going up and coming back down. I was now acclimatized, and I'm resting back at base camp. There was actually a rescue that was going on while I was at base camp, and unbeknownst to me, it was one of the guys that I had trekked in with had gotten haze and had been hallucinating for 2 days.
And haze, just for all the listeners, is
high altitude cerebral edema.
Cerebral edema. Yeah, so that's your brain. So your brain swells, and when your brain swells, the swelling makes it essentially you lose your motor function, you lose all kinds of things. You get dizzy, you get confused. So that can be really, really scary, and you can die pretty quickly with haze unless you descend rapidly, right?
So they tried to descend, but like I said, there was weather every day, and they were trying to get a helicopter to do what's called a long line rescue, where they drop a rope from the helicopter and pluck them off the mountain, but the weather was too bad. And so he spent, I think, 2 days at Camp 2 and a day at Camp 1 actually recovering because the lower you go, the less altitude illness you have. And so he actually recovered fully and was able to hike himself down, but he had no recollection of the events of about 3 days. He thought that he was being manhandled by his guides when he was actually being carried. He thought that they were trying to escort him into a temple so they could worship with them, but they were just trying to tuck him into a sleeping bag. He was really out of his mind for a couple of days, hallucinating. Yeah. And so that always puts your mindset in like, oh God, I don't even have a Sherpa guide who can help me. And here I am still trying to go up solo. And I have a lot of experience with altitude in terms of going up some big peaks, but I also have a lot of experience with medicine. I'm actually an emergency physician, and I've studied high altitude medicine through the Wilderness Medical Society, and I actually teach for them in a program called the Diploma in Mountain Medicine. So I felt like I had a good handle on recognizing symptoms. However, once you've sort of crossed over into the hallucinating, you're no longer yourself and you can't help yourself. So that was actually my biggest fear going up there solo. I wasn't afraid of falling. I wasn't afraid of the rope work. I was afraid of getting sick at altitude. So I was very careful about my acclimatization and went up and down the mountain several times before I decided to push on to Camp 2. But I wanted to be around other climbers. I didn't want to be up there all alone. I didn't mind taking care of myself. I just didn't want to be up there solo. So I found a group that was going up, and I introduced myself to a lovely couple from Denmark who were going up, and they were being guided. They each had their own Sherpa guide. And I found another guy who was, I believe, from Norway, who was going up solo, much like I was. And there was a guy from Australia who was going up, but he didn't quite make it even to Camp 1. He spent one night at Camp 1 and bailed, or Camp 2, sorry, and bailed. And two ladies from, one was from Romania and the other was from Thailand. And
wow, what a group!
It was amazing. Yeah, it was very international.
Yeah.
The couple from Denmark, they were both physicians. He was training and about to start his residency in the Navy, and she was a full physician, but she was originally from the UK. So they both spoke fluent English, and she had a lovely English accent and also spoke Dutch fluently. And we played a lot of games waiting out weather together. They were just great people. And I actually just found out, they just emailed me and said they just got engaged like this week because I had said, hey, this girl's going up a mountain with you and she is tolerating a lot of stuff for your dreams. But it was Bart's dream to climb this mountain. And he's like, I gotta think about that. And she wrote me and said, well, it turns out he listened to you and decided I was a keeper.
Oh, well, hopefully you get an invitation to their wedding.
Oh, that'd be sweet. And so we basically all left base camp on the same day and got to Camp 1. And it was snowing as per the normal. And we spent the night and decided to wait and to see if there was a weather window. And a weather window was definitely coming, but it was going to snow the next day. So what we decided to do was to climb through the snowstorm to Camp 2 and make it to Camp 2 and wait out the snowstorm and see if we had time to go immediately that night or wait a whole day. And so there's now 10 inches of fresh snow on a mostly horizontal trek at about 20,000 feet across a knife edge ridge for, it's probably 1.5 miles or so. And it's all roped. It's all fixed ropes. And so you're in your big mountaineering boots. It's all fixed ropes. You're actually guessing what rope is the good rope because there's usually about 3 or 4 ropes on every traverse. Some of them are like hardware store ropes, and some of them are clearly climbing ropes. And sometimes you only have the hardware store rope to use, and sometimes it's a nice climbing rope. Sometimes you get to the end of it.
Why would you only have the one? Like, why would you only be able to use the hardware one instead of the?
Oh, because that's all that was actually there. So not every pitch had multiple ropes. So some of these horizontal pitches only had a fixed rope that was. It wasn't a kern mantle. It was a twisted braided rope. So a 3-strand braided rope, like you would see from the hardware store, or like a dock line for a boat. So a lot of this was, not climbing specific. A lot of this hardware that I saw, especially the ropes, because it makes you a little nervous. You're like, oh, what am I actually holding my life onto? And some of the anchors were, beautiful 3-point anchors with like a glue-in bolt that's meant for climbing. And some of them were solo ice screws that were half hanging out. And that's it, just one ice screw, which is nerve-wracking. And I conferred with all the guides and all their clients, and I said, how would you like me to fit into your group? And one of the lead guides said, why don't you go first and break trail for half the day? In this fresh 10 inches of snow, you have to, make a trail. There's no way to get through without literally pulling the ropes out of the ice, sliding your ascender or Jumar along so that it's a one-way ascension device. It goes up the rope but won't come back down. So hopefully it catches you if you fall. And you slide your ropes along, break the ice up, and you make trails with your feet. And I was like, wow, that's going to be a lot of work. So I'll do it, no problem. And a halfway mark, we'll trade places. It took me about 4 or 5 hours to get to Camp 2, and it took all the clients over 11 hours to get there. So I left bright and early, and I made it there by myself, and I never saw them again for 11 hours. So I made it to Camp 2, and I picked a tent and just hung out. It was really beautiful. It was snowing off and on. There's I can't name the phenomenon, but you cast a shadow of yourself into the clouds when you're up at altitude. So the sun is setting and I'm casting an infinitely long shadow into the clouds. And it's just a really gorgeous phenomenon. And you can only really get it on a mountain peak. It has to be a cloudy mountain peak and your shadow goes on infinitely into the distance. It's really beautiful.
Yeah, I bet.
And then there's like a sundog rainbow around me in the photo. It's really gorgeous. And the first person to come up, and this should have been a sign of trouble to come, was the Australian gentleman came up by himself. He was solo, but he had been guided, and he was not the fastest hiker. And I was a little curious why he was alone. And it turns out that his Sherpa guide had decided to help some of the other clients do these traverses. There is actually like a 5.9 vertical pitch that's supposed to be beautiful climbing. I would love to have climbed it, but because I was in big boots, you end up ascending it with a Jumar more than climbing it. And he was the first to arrive, and about an hour later, some other clients and guides roll in, and we all pick our tents. I ended up with the Australian in sharing a tent. These tents are, there's only about 6 tents there for about a dozen of us. So we all have to share. And it turns out the weather was too bad to go on the next day. So we decided to wait it out a whole day. Normally the process is you go immediately that night at about 11 o'clock at night. But 2 things. One, none of the clients were ready for it because it had taken them 11 hours to do what should have been a 5 or 6 hour traverse. And 2, it was still bad weather. And I think I made a little bit of a mistake by agreeing and saying, hey, I'll wait it out too, because the next day was probably okay weather. I could have gone right away. But I decided to hang out at Camp 2 with everybody else because I didn't want to be totally alone. Here I was supposed to be unguided, but I was a little nervous about being alone. So I waited it out with everybody. I had a terrible night's sleep. The poor Australian gentleman.
The Australian.
Yeah, the Australian. He had what's called the Kumbu cough. Everybody coughs all the time. The dry air, the high altitude, you just cough nonstop. And I didn't have the heart to tell him, but he needed some tent etiquette lessons as well. He didn't have a pee bottle with him. So he would get up in the middle of the night, just unzip his bag, kneel in the vestibule, and pee into the vestibule. So the next morning, you have to crawl across Australian piss to make it out of the tent. He didn't sleep well either. His cough was really bad, so he actually decided to bail. And now, who's left are the Denmark couple, the Norwegian solo guy, the Romanian lady, and the Thai lady. They're left, and they all have, except for the Norwegian, they all have their own individual high altitude guide. And it's a lovely day. We basically boil water all day. And the Sherpas discovered my stove. I have a really lovely MSR universal, Whisperlight universal with a special pot. I think it's a Primus pot that has heat conduction fins on it. And so my pot just blew everybody else's away. So they stole all my stuff, and they're boiling water all day long to make, about a gallon per person. So you got to make 12 gallons of water for all these people to get up the mountain. And because of that, I bonded with some of the guides. They fed me. They made sure I was comfortable. I kept telling them I was fine. I had my own stuff, but they insisted on feeding me. I wasn't going to argue with them.
You didn't have your stuff anymore because they had your stuff.
They did. They took my stuff. And I was happy to share. It's just a, literally very tight knit community, and up there it's 6 tents about 15 feet apart. They're just really, and there's no place to go. You're hanging onto a rope anywhere you go. You walk 10 feet in any direction and you're falling off a cliff. We take a little nap at about 8 p.m. And sleep as much as we can. And we start getting rolling probably around 10, 11 p.m. To start hiking at about 1 a.m. It's a really long process. I don't know if you've ever spent any time in extreme cold at extreme altitude, but it's about 4 or 5 layers on the bottom, and it's about 5 or 6 layers on top, plus 2 pairs of gloves, et cetera, et cetera. So it's like an hour process to just get out of your tent, put on everything, strap on crampons, and get ready to go.
Yeah, the highest mountain I've climbed was Cotopaxi, and then I also was maybe 500 feet-ish shy of the summit of Antisana, but nowhere near, where the elevation that you're talking about. Still cold.
Yeah, it was pretty cold. Not as cold as Denali. Denali hit negative 30. This was only like, negative 10 Fahrenheit. And it wasn't brutally cold. I would say it was very cold, but not brutally cold. And I'm witnessing some people get ready, and some people seem extremely capable, and some people seem to require a lot of help. And another sort of warning flag of what was to come, the lady from Thailand couldn't lace up her own boots, didn't know how to put on her own crampons, and was taking what I described as Instagram shots of her sort of being catered to. And it made me nervous. It was really obvious to me that there was an extreme variety of skill levels. And at this point, I kind of want to back up a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about my resume in terms of why I felt like I was ready for this to go solo. And I spent years sort of accumulating experience. I got guided when I first started climbing. I took a couple guided classes on how to place gear. I mean, we're talking 1996, 95, somewhere in there. I got a mentor. I moved down to the LA area and spent a lot of time with other climbers and just followed a lot of pitches. Did a lot of Eastern Sierra climbs, anything from, alpine ice to water ice to, just beautiful 20 pitch rock climbs. And all that stuff includes taking care of yourself in the backcountry. It includes walking in boots, big, heavy mountaineering boots. It includes rock scrambling, use of tools, single tool, two tools for ice axes, and the rope work required, the learning how to transition yourself from climbing to descending to jumaring to belaying your partner. All those they become second nature and smooth. I ended up doing a couple of big walls. I've climbed the nose, lurking fear. Again, not in a day. I'm not that special. I'm not that good. But, you spend that time on the rock and that time in the air and you just get super comfortable. And that is, I think, an accumulation of skills over the course of about 30 years where I was like, I can probably handle anything technically that comes my way. And I spent all this time accumulating these skills to the point where I was like, you know what? I don't want to be guided anymore. My wife and I had an experience. She was not as skilled in the mountains as I was, but I didn't feel like I could teach her. So we got guided up Rainier once in about 2004. And we spent a morning huddled in a lightning storm, unable to move because the guides didn't want to go down. And all of my instincts were like, we need to get out of where we are and go down. And I really don't like that feeling of not having the capability of making my own decisions. And ironically, I started my climbing career as a guide, and now I no longer like being guided. But it is, I think, an important step is to be guided and to understand and be taught rather than to just show up and say, I'm a climber. And I was getting that impression from some of the climbers on the mountain next to me, was that they had minimal to no skills. And I didn't know how minimal they were until later that night. So we left camp. Some people got in front of us who had less skills, were a little slower. So when you're climbing and there's only a single rope to ascend, passing is very difficult. So it took a little while. We probably caught up to them in 20 minutes, but it probably took an hour to pass them. And we eventually sorted all out. I'm now among the lead, like 4 out of the 10 of us who are left. And we're all ascending a rope. And I realized at some point that the skill levels were so varied that I was trying to rock climb and just use my ascender as a safety device. And a lot of people were just ascending the rope and pulling on the rope. And I got to an anchor, and it was a single piton in the rock that was about half out. And that is not an anchor by any stretch of the imagination. That is a tenuous piece of gear at best. And there were 4 people below me ascending this rope and
pulling on that one piece.
Pulling on one piece.
Like waiting on that one piece. Yeah. Bouncing on it. I can imagine them bouncing on it as the rope goes up and down in your hand. Yeah.
Yep. And I actually had a little, I don't know if I've ever had a panic attack before in my life, but I actually had a little bit of a panic attack. I was really struggling to continue on, knowing that I was in danger, partially because of the equipment, but partially because of the skill level of the other people below me. What they should have been doing was climbing the rock and using the rope as a backup, but instead they were using the rope as their primary method of ascending. It really freaked me out for about 10, 15 minutes. I had to stop at that anchor, sort of get onto the next rope, so I felt a little safer, and decide if I really wanted to still keep going. It took me about 10, 15 minutes to gather myself and decide to press on. I realized I was actually much, much faster than the people beneath me, so I could actually get a rope length away from them and feel a little better. And so the four people in the lead were Bart from Denmark and his guide, the other solo from Norway, I believe his name was Ethan, and myself. And so we were now moving much faster than the rest of the group. And we made it up to Camp 3 area. And Camp 3 is not always used. It's actually kind of a dangerous spot. It's been wiped out by avalanches in the past. And we got to Camp 3 and realized that an avalanche had come through. And the ropes got buried into the snow. We were able to find the ropes, probably another 100 yards away. They came back out of the snow, and we kept ascending. And about 2 pitches after that, so another, let's say 400 feet after that, vertically, the ropes just disappeared into the snow again, and they didn't reappear. And it was fairly vertical. It was probably a 70 to 80 degree slope. It's doable with crampons and one axe. But with no safety equipment, no ropes ahead of us, it would require ice screws and a lead rope, which we didn't have. And the rope just disappeared into the snow. And we could actually see anchors dangling above us. So we're not even sure that the rope is actually attached to anything other than its own self buried into the snow. So we actually quickly descended. And I think the guide had a radio to communicate with the other guides and tell them time to turn around.
And it was time to turn around because you didn't have the equipment to move forward. Like you said, you didn't have ice screws or a rope.
Yep.
And the one rope that was fixed was just totally buried.
Yes.
So you're like, well, we kind of hit your stopping point.
Yeah. So we're about 200 meters or so vertically from the top at this point, maybe an hour or two worth of ascending. And we had to stop. We had to turn around. There was just no way to safely go without more equipment. And nobody had 2 ice axes and a lead rope and ice screws. So
when you got to Camp 3 and you saw that Camp 3 had fairly recently been hit by an avalanche, what were you thinking? Did that freak you out?
It definitely did. You could tell that the debris was a couple of days old because it was windblown, and nobody had been up there for several days because it had been snowing constantly and there was no weather window. So nobody had been up for about 4 or 5 days. You could tell that the debris was, I don't know, days old. I'm not an expert, but it was certainly not fresh that night. It had been windblown and scoured. And honestly, I rationalized it as, well, that avalanche happened. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. And there is some safety to that. You know, there's always hang fire. There's always the possibility of more debris coming down. You're obviously in an avalanche prone terrain, but that big avalanche
that already come down.
that wiped out the ropes had already come down. So I was probably better than I would have been 5 days ago. That was my theory.
Nervous, but also relieved. Yeah. You're like, oh, that's eye-opening, and also it already came down.
Yeah.
So okay. All right, carry on. Sorry to interrupt. I just was thinking about that.
So we decided to turn around wisely. I knew at that moment my climb was done. I had thought about quitting several times. I was sick at first. I was very lonely at some points during this, waiting out weather windows. I'd thought about turning around several times. And I was very happy, actually, that it was the mountain that stopped me. It wasn't my decision. It was the mountain's decision. And I was very comfortable and very satisfied. I had been feeling great. I knew I could make it the rest of the way. I didn't have any effects of altitude illness at all at that point. I was feeling very strong, very capable. And it was purely the mountain that turned around. I don't feel like I failed. I feel like the mountain just said no to me that day. And I was happy with that decision from the mountain. So that's a very satisfying way to end a climb, as opposed to, I don't feel like I failed. I just feel like the answer was no today. And so we turned around. It took us about 4 hours, maybe 5 hours of climbing to get to this high point. We turned around and we caught up to the people who were still ascending, and they had obviously turned around and started descending. And now there's 4 people catching up to 6 people, and we caught up to them very quickly. It's now, just to give you an idea, we left at say 10 or 11, so it's now 3 in the morning-ish, and still pitch black. We're still all using headlamps, and we all stopped. So just so everybody understands, only one person can descend a rope at a time. Multiple people can ascend a rope at the same time, but only one person can rappel at a time. And so you have to wait for somebody to unweight the rope and clip into the next rope before the next person can go. And it turns out 2 of the climbers had no idea how to rappel. They just didn't know how to rappel. So they had to wait for their guides to hook them up, set them up for a rappel, have somebody below them for a safety called a fireman's belay, and have somebody above them to hook them up. And so every rappel took 20 minutes per person, approximately.
You're bottlenecked.
Or totally bottlenecked. I was actually now sort of the 4 who had gone up the highest, I was now the first to descend, just because I was the 4th to go up. And when you turn around, that's just the way it works out. So now I'm first to descend, so I'm waiting the least. And in order to assist, the guide for the couple, both guides, had decided to go help the other 2 clients who didn't have any skills. So in order for those clients to have a Sherpa above them and below them, it took a 2-to-1 ratio. And so the guides for Bart and Claire, those were their names, Bart and Claire's guides actually left them because they were quite capable, and went down to assist the lady from Romania and the lady from Thailand who had no skills whatsoever. So they were moving very slow. And now there's 4 of us with no Sherpas, no radio, all descending on our own. And we're all quite capable. We all feel very comfortable in this terrain. And it's now taking 4 hours of sitting on a ridge waiting to move maybe 200 vertical feet. It's a really slow process. And Bart got cold. 4 hours of sitting still on a windy ridge at 21,000, 22,000 feet is dangerous. And it's becoming life-threatening how long we had to wait. I still felt good. I was still moving, and I completed a rappel. And I call up after every rappel and tell the person above me, off rappel. I yell up, off rappel. So the next person knows that they can hook in and start descending the rope. And all I heard back was help. I thought that was very odd. Nothing had happened. There was no fall. There was no, clamor of falling ice and rocks. It was just help.
Was it a man or a woman's voice?
It was a man's voice. There was only 2 people above me at that time.
So it was Bart.
It was Bart. Yeah. And I couldn't figure out why. He was too far away to communicate with. All I could hear was the help. We called up again. We heard help again. I said, I got to go back up. So I had to ascend the ropes and assess the situation. And it takes a long time. When you're at 21,000 feet, you don't just jug up 200 feet of rope in 5 minutes. It takes 15, 20 minutes. You take 10 steps, you jug as fast as you can, and then you got to breathe for 2 minutes. And then you take 10 steps and you jug as fast as you can, and you got to breathe for 2 minutes. So it probably took me 20 minutes to get back up to him. And the poor guy was still in his belay device, just dangling from the rope above, because his hands were too cold to manipulate his locking carabiners. So he couldn't clip in with his leash to the next anchor, and he couldn't unclip his belay device. He couldn't move the locking mechanism. He couldn't unscrew it. And so he's a little hypothermic. He's a little confused. He starts speaking to me in Dutch. knowing full well we've been hanging out for a week, knowing full well I don't speak any Dutch.
So his level of consciousness is declining.
Yep.
He's lost some motor skills, so that this is hypothermia.
Yeah. So he's in a bad place, and his Sherpa is gone, and we have no communications. So now it's just Bart and I at 21,000 feet, and the closest Sherpa is probably 600 feet below us, and Ethan's below us. He turned out to be a very capable guy, which I was very happy about. And so I hooked him up into a rappel rig, a dual rappel rig, where I leashed myself to him, and then I had an extender where I belayed us both down, rappelling both people at one time, and made it back down to Ethan. And Ethan actually had the good idea of saying, "Hey, why don't I go down? You hook Bart up for the next couple rappels. You stay here with him, hook him up, and I will be the backup called a fireman's belay from below," which is a much faster way and safer way. Because Bart could move, he could walk, his feet worked, but he couldn't move his hands. He couldn't clip himself in and out. So all he had to do was walk backwards, and we could essentially lower him with a fireman's belay. And that worked out really well. So we got about 2 more rope lengths down that way. And Bart started to recover some motor function, just moving him, just getting him going again. He started to recuperate. And at this point, it is now just becoming sunrise. And so we're going from -10 to 0, and we're feeling much better about the whole thing.
And he's moving his body, which is also
he's
warming him up a little bit. Mm-hmm.
I think we made him eat and drink something, and got him going again. And this whole time, he's clearly upset. He's angry at the people below us. I'm angry at them too, because they wouldn't let us pass. They wouldn't pull off to the side, and they had no idea that an entire rescue had happened above them. This is probably a 2 to 3 hour process, and his paid guides just didn't know. And his guide, I think, made a tough decision like, "Oh, this is dangerous. I'm going to go help the slow people so that we can all move faster." I think that was probably the wrong call in the end, but I understand why he made that call. And we finally get back to camp 2. It's now full daylight, and everybody's feeling much better. We're at a lower altitude. It's much warmer. It's a bright, sunny day. The weather would have been perfect for a summit attempt, unfortunately.
Oh,
yeah.
That's how it goes.
Absolutely gorgeous day. And we all rest for, I don't know, 5 or 6 more hours at camp. So we rest until, let's say, noon, and then decide to descend all the way back down to base camp, which is a long day. And I guess Bart had it out with one of the slower of the party, and actually yelled at her and told her that, "You risked my life." He said that he made her cry, and there's I don't ever want to scold somebody that much, but there was a little tiny bit of me. I was like, good. She needed to learn a lesson that she had actually, put somebody else's life at risk because of her lack of skills.
It's good to give feedback for sure, because she might not have had any idea.
It's true.
She paid for an experience too, and she just happened to be with a group that was faster. Dynamics weren't great for the summit, and she probably had no idea. She's probably way out of her element, it sounds like, and so she's just so focused on, the task at hand instead of the group dynamics, the bigger picture.
Yeah, no, I can see all that, and I understand it, but at the same time, that sense of self-responsibility and group responsibility it wasn't there. She had no self-awareness of whether or not she should be in the mountains or not. And while I can fault her to a point, you should really fault the people who encouraged her to sign up for it in the first place. And they have a little school where they actually take people up and down a rock. It's probably a 30-foot tall rock down at base camp, when they do a little jumaring practice and a little rappelling practice. And there's no way that she was competent enough to actually demonstrate those skills. I actually witnessed her the next day trying to get between camp, or later that afternoon, trying to get between camp 1 and 2. And again, she had 2 guides literally being manhandled around corners on little horizontal traverses, something that a competent climber would have just, hung on, found a toe hold, maybe weighted the rope and just pulled themselves around the corner, literally carried between, two sort of open exposed points, maybe 15 feet. She had to be carried. And that's where I came back to the experience of, do you know how to go across a talus field with boots on? If you can't do that, you shouldn't be there. And if you've never done that, you shouldn't be there. And I say boots in particular because it's so different between like a pair of sneakers and a pair of shoes and a pair of boots. And it's, what was.
And then a pair of boots with a pair of crampons on the boots.
Yeah.
I mean, that's also a
Yeah.
huge difference. Does this company, do they have a skills check? And if you can't pass the skills check, you can't go up? I mean, it sounds like they do have that boulder down there to check out your skills, but it didn't, whether she had the skills or not, she still got to go up. So,
well, just to be clear, I don't know what company she was with. The company that I was with didn't test me at all because I wasn't being guided. So I went over there and watched some people do it, and the people that I watched on the skills check were quite competent. So I don't know what her skills check was like, but I would think that that's definitely one of the things I want to talk about is that they should be failed. People should actually be failed. And I think there's so much pressure financially and culturally to just say yes to the client that it puts other people at risk. And I think, we've seen that in lines on Everest, and we've seen that, I've personally seen that in a line of climbers on Ama Dablam. Somebody should have said no to them. And that's one of the lessons I take from this, is that there should be a no refunds, no, you don't have the skills to be here. Or a mandatory resume check of some kind. Yeah, you've climbed, Avalanche Goldstone Shasta, but that's just walking. What have you done to actually support yourself in the backcountry? Have you ever ascended a rope before? Have you ever placed a piece of gear yourself? Have you ever used an ice axe or crampons yourself? That kind of skills check is severely lacking, and I think that's a huge part of the danger we were in. And one of the reasons that this was a test for me to see if I should do an 8,000 meter peak, and Everest has crossed my mind. And I think it's 100% no for me because of the people, not because of the mountain, not because of the risks of avalanche or the Khumbu icefall technical. It's the people. I think the people make it dangerous. And I'm sort of disappointed that I won't get a chance to do that in my life, unless something drastic changes in terms of the way they manage the clients. But I was,
like you're saying, unless there's parameters,
yeah,
like a skills check or resume check.
Yeah.
Which would weed out maybe half of the folks that are climbing Everest.
But I think the resume check is more of a wallet biopsy than an actual resume check.
Right now it is,
yeah.
Sounds like.
Yeah. In the end, I ended up coming all the way back down to camp and spent a couple days. A lot of people flew out directly from camp. I was shocked at the helicopter usage. They're like taxi cabs in the region. If you have enough money, it's a $3,000 taxi ride back to Kathmandu. And I decided that was not the way I was going to go. A, I couldn't afford that, and B, it defeats the purpose. I mean, this trip was an experience to be in the mountains, to be immersed in a culture, immersed in a place, and a helicopter ride takes that away 100%. And I know that some of the people that I'm describing flew out because some people used their insurance. They said they were sick. They were perfectly capable of walking. They just didn't want to. So they used their evacuation insurance and called it in and said, "Fly me out." So,
wow.
Yeah, it's crazy. And one of the things that they have to do after that is they have to check into the hospital. They have to at least go to the emergency room after they use their insurance to fly out. So I had one lady who was not part of this group, but she described to me her experience and said, "Well, yeah, it saves me 2 days of trekking, but I have to spend an afternoon in an ER." Like that was the trade-off in their mind was, "Oh, I gotta go to the ER after this to use my insurance, but it's only an afternoon as opposed to 2 days of trekking."
Well, the integrity. Where's the integrity?
I as an emergency physician, I was horrified that people would use the services and the emergency room that way. But also not surprised because I've seen it, in the United States. I was
But then
just shocked to
people
see it.
that need that service can't use it because there's somebody else sitting there in the waiting room. And what if there's a real emergency that, I mean, that just makes me really sad.
It's a horrifying abuse. I agree. And I witnessed it at least with one person who basically just said they were done and they wanted a faster way out of there. So it was, I don't know. I couldn't do it. I know I couldn't do it. My honor system is above that.
Oh my gosh. Okay, well, so what are some of the things that you learned that you want to share with the listeners then?
So one of the things I learned, and I'm very sad to mention this on your podcast because I know that Rocky Talkie is a big sponsor of yours, but GMRS radios are not in service in Nepal. I wish I'd brought my my little Baofeng. I could have programmed it to the channels that they were using. My base camp manager actually gave me a radio, so I had one with me for a lot of it, but not for the rescue portion. That was a mistake that I made. I wished I'd had the radio in a pocket that was accessible. I did not. I left it back.
And that's great feedback for me too, because I didn't know that they weren't that they didn't work out of.
They work. They're just nobody used them. And so those specific frequencies, I'm sure they would work just fine if you had a pair of them. They just aren't used in Nepal. So I couldn't talk to base camp. You can't talk to the helicopters. You can't talk to other people because nobody else has them.
Right.
I think they're a wonderful tool. I actually just used them last week. I was on a Jeep tour, and I broke down and I had to get a part into the 6 miles into the backcountry, and I used the radio to get parts. It was great.
Perfect.
And then safety in numbers. I always felt climbing like, hey, I there's other people doing this. It must be okay. But that's a classic trap. And I think I would have been safer if I had decided to go on my own on the day that the weather was okay, but we were waiting for the other clients to come up. I probably would have been safer to just do it on my own. I still wouldn't have been able to summit because the avalanche still would have been there and still would have wiped out the ropes. But I probably would have been up in 4 hours and down in 2 instead of down in 7.
But you wouldn't have known that the weather was going to be good enough to go, right?
I had a pretty good weather app. I was using two weather apps. When I had service, I would use mountainforecast.com. I found them to be very good. And then the Garmin InReach, you can actually download weather directly to your InReach, and that was pretty accurate as well. But it's always tough. You're like, well, what does a 35% chance of snow really mean? Does that mean I'm going to get dumped on? Right. Or does that mean it's going to snow for 2 hours? So, and then lastly, I trust your instincts. I didn't mind going solo.
Totally.
But I saw so many red flags, and in the back of my mind, I recognized all of them, and I even verbalized them to other people, but I still chose to ignore them.
That's interesting.
And I knew that these other clients were going to cause problems for us. I just didn't know how badly they were going to cause problems for us. I had an experience once as a guide where I criticized somebody, and I told them, what you're doing is questionable or unsafe. And I kind of got yelled at by one of my bosses, like, don't ever do that. And I came up with my own mantra of the only time I ever tell somebody or correct somebody about their behavior is if I think they're going to die right now. Like they're not tied in and they're about to start a climb, or they're about to rappel and their belay device isn't hooked in correctly, I will stop them. If it's just a bad habit, or if it's a questionable, like, that's not the way I would do it, I don't say anything. And so I use that mantra of like, that's not the way I would do it. Oh my goodness, I would not guide that lady. That's crazy. She doesn't have the skills. And so I kept my mouth shut. And maybe I should have said something. I don't know. I think the clients literally put other people's lives at risk, including my own. Sitting 4 hours on that windy ridge, I was just lucky that I was a little bit warmer than Bart was, and didn't get hypothermic. And It could have been me, and I could have been stuck up there alone with, I didn't even have a Sherpa who was going to come back for me if I didn't show up. And so if you see something, say something. I know it's a bit of a cliche lately, but maybe it would have been worth saying something. Pulled somebody aside as gently as possible and literally say, I don't think you're ready for this. I've been watching you for 2 days climb next to me, and you're too slow. This is dangerous for you. I think you should really think about finding another mountain and getting some more training. Not saying no.
Or another way to frame it too is, do you think that you're ready for this? That way it's not so much of an attack. Like, hey, I don't know if you're ready for this, because they might think that they are. It sounds like she probably had no idea what she was getting herself into, So really having her sit down and reflect on, hey, do you think that you're ready for this? Do you know what the risks are here? Do you know what the next moves are here, what the progression of climbing this mountain is? And then she would probably not be able to answer and come up with her own idea.
No, it would be really tough because, she could turn around and say, well, my guide says I'll be fine, And,
right.
And there's there's $1,000 summit bonus coming to the guide's way if he gets her up there. And so if you said to them, hey,
is that true? Yeah. Is there a $1,000 bonus for a guide if they can get their client to the summit? That's true.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Bart's guide wanted the summit bonus, and Bart said, absolutely not. I didn't stand on the summit. And he's like, but I got you up and down safely. And he's like, no, you abandoned me. Absolutely not. I'm not paying the summit bonus.
Wow. I feel like that should be illegal.
It's a conflict of interest for sure.
Well, also you're prioritizing money over people's safety. I mean, everybody wants $1,000 bonus. I want $1,000 bonus. But if all you can see is the money bag sitting on top of the summit, then you're blinded to everything else. You have tunnel vision. Wow, that is really terrifying.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either, because I didn't sign up for that, that method of climbing. I just had the services up to base camp. And when I heard about this, I was like, that's just such a conflict of interest. How is it possible to be reasonable about the safety when you have not just summit fever, you have bonus fever,
money fever? Yeah. And I have no idea. I've never been to Nepal, but I do know that it's a poorer country, right? I mean, and so these folks are not as well off, say, as Americans. Is that a true statement, or is that pretty rude to say?
No, I mean, it's beyond what you think it is. It's orders of magnitude difference. So, I mean, your right. average worker who is, let's say, at a McDonald's making $16 an hour in California, that would be probably 10 times the daily wage of somebody in Nepal. So, we're talking.
So $1,000 is a lot.
It is a lot of money.
Money.
That's a huge motivator. Yes. I mean, we're talking about a country where some people make $1,000 a year. So $1,000 for a summit is a mind-boggling amount of money. And I know I totally appreciate how climbers climbing have built hospitals in the region, have brought tourism dollars. The wealthiest population in Nepal, according to something I had perused on my pre-travel planning, is the town of Namche Bazaar, because so many tourists come through and there's so many hotels and well-paid workers in that region. We're talking about an area that's maybe 2 square miles, is the wealthiest region in the country because of tourism. And so I see tourism as an economy, and I think that that's a wonderful thing to bring a economic lever to the people, but sometimes that lever is used inappropriately and can break things. And this was definitely a case where summit fever and summit bonus, $1,000 to get somebody who literally doesn't know how to rappel, doesn't know how to walk across talus field in boots. That's just dangerous for everybody else on the mountain. And that $1,000 wasn't worth rescuing Bart wasn't worth, the hypothermia he experienced. And I know, I'm not trying to brag. I'm sure somebody else would have gone up to help him, but what if there was no other client who was a solo capable climber, and it was just guided clients on a terrible, with no skills? Who was going to go up and get him? Nobody. There was nobody around for him. And so, the motivations are a little backwards. The training is lacking for the clients for sure. And I think this is something to say more broadly about climbers. There's, the lack of mentorship, and sort of the gym mentality of like, I've been climbing, I've been to the gym. And then you get out and somebody hands you a rack of brassies and says, okay, now survive with this rack of brassies. You'd be like, what are these things? What do they do? And so people think they understand the sport and understand the skills, only to find out they know nothing. And I still feel that way. I still feel like I'm learning more and more and more. And I've taken some self-rescue courses, and people teach me tricks. And, there's guides out there that can tie knots I never heard of. And I'm like, wow, that's actually useful. That's not just a cool party trick. That's a useful skill. I've never even seen that. Learning how to rappel with a munter, just a munter, or a carabiner brake rappel. These are things that people don't know anymore. And if they are used to climbing with a gree-gree, they have no idea how to rappel. They have no idea how to get off of
But when you lose your gree-gree,
yeah, you're done.
Then, or it's iced over, then you're going to need to know, you're going to need to have backups, which is rappelling off the munter, right? So,
and so I think that
I think that you're right. Like being a well-rounded climber, if you're a gym climber, that's fine. But being, know your scope of experience, and you can't go from gym to go lead 5, 7+ on traditional gear. I mean, you have to there's steps in between,
Yeah,
and so I think that's what you're saying, and I appreciate that for sure.
And it's not a one weekend course. It's years of learning, how to do this.
You have to be a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
Yes.
And so somebody asked me once, there's like, how do you learn how to place trad gear? I'm like, go aid climb. Learn how to aid climb, place literally 1,000 pieces in a 5-day climb, and then you will trust your gear and you will understand, or follow that and take out 1,000 pieces on a 5-day climb and learn what it looks like, what's a good piece of gear, what's not a good piece of gear. And it takes time. And I think
that's how I learned to trad gear. Was my ex-boyfriend, who's still a super, super good friend of mine. He lives in Alta, Wyoming. Hi, Brandon. He probably doesn't listen to this podcast, but if he does, hey, hi, Brandon. He taught me how to trad climb. He taught me how to climb, actually. And the first 3 years that I was climbing behind Brandon, he never let me lead. He's like, nope. We only climbed on gear. And I'm like, hey, can I lead yet? I think I'm ready. He's like, nope, nope, nope. And he just made me study all the pieces that he would place, and he'd make me clean every piece that he placed. And then after 3 years of cleaning up his gear, then he's like, okay, I think you're ready. Yeah. Let's go to City of Rocks.
And I think that's the classic mentorship.
Amazing.
Yeah, classic mentorship.
Yes, I'm so grateful for it, because when I actually went to do my first lead, I was terrified, but I also felt like I had seen enough gear placements where I felt somewhat confident. When your first lead, you're always like, get the Elvis foot, but thanks to him, I think he gave me really great mentorship.
I'm working on that with my sons. My older son is extremely strong. He's finally surpassing me. But he doesn't know how to clip, that sort of that smooth, fluid, like stick your middle finger in and twist the rope in, stick your middle finger in and twist the rope in, grab it, put your thumb in, flip the rope in. And he's like, I got it, Dad. And then he's like, he's on a 5'11", and he's like, got the Elvis foot, and he's like fumbling a clip. And I'm like, oh God, you're not ready yet.
Do it, go make
it. So we're not even to gear yet. We're still working on our sport clips. So we got a ways to go.
Yeah, proud dad right there. Well, thank you so much for sharing. Is there anything that you want to leave the listeners with? If you have one last final thing you want to end with?
Get out there, enjoy yourself. Go to Nepal because it's a gorgeous place, even if you're not a climber. The people are just lovely human beings. Everybody I met was just the nicest. The taxi driver that I'm like, you're really going to drive me around all day? He waited for me at everything, every little tourist spot. It was just wonderful people. Go, it's a gorgeous spot. And then climbing wise, go get guided. Go get private guided. Tell them you want to learn how to place gear. You want to learn how to escape a belay. You want to learn how to rappel with a munter and a gree and do a 2-rope rappel with a gree. How does that work? How could I possibly make that happen? Learn all these tricks so that when you go into the alpine, you're much safer than you were before, and you understand the systems. You're not just blindly climbing, and you have no bag of tricks to rely on. You might be able to get up and down, no problem, but if something goes wrong, you have no backups. You have no other skills to escape. And I think learning those tricks before you go to someplace dangerous, the sport crag with 1,000 people is not nearly as dangerous as even climbing in the Eastern Sierra, where there's no other parties around, and it's only a 5.7, but you're hosed if your rope gets stuck. You got to figure it out.
You're exposed. Yep. You're remote. Yep.
So learn those skills before you go and get yourself hurt or hurt somebody else.